So today we are joined by Ed Hagen, who is an evolutionary anthropologist and a professor in the Department of Anthropology at Washington State University, Vancouver. Ed has carried out long-term research with Aka foragers in the Central African Republic. And over 10 years ago, Ed gave a talk at BEC on the subject of the use of plants to treat and prevent helminth infections and other pathogens. And this shows his long-term commitment to this branch of evolutionary research. And we're delighted today, Ed, that you could join us and provide us with an updated and expanded treatment of that topic. So thank you very much, Ed, whose talk is titled Homo medicus, the transition to meat eating, increased pathogen pressure, and the constitutive and inducible use of pharmacological plants in Homo. Thanks a lot, Ed. Welcome to BEC.
Thanks for having me. This is a project that I've just started working on in the last few months with Aaron Blackwell, former grad student Aaron Leitner, and a longtime collaborator Roger Sullivan. So please feel free to jump in at any time with questions, comments, criticisms. I'll also be monitoring the chat, so if you want to throw stuff in there, I'll try and respond. I have about 50 slides, so I'm going to move kind of quickly, but feel free to interrupt me at any point. So one of the big themes that I'll be addressing is encephalization, the dramatic increase in brain size in humans. And the standard story is that hunting was cognitively demanding and meat is a high quality food. So when we transitioned from a mostly plant-based diet to a mostly meat-based diet, that at the one hand provided more energy for brain maintenance, but also was a selection pressure on increased brain size. So what I'm going to argue here today, I think that's a good story and it's one that we adopt, but I'm going to add a few wrinkles to it. And the argument here is that the transition to meat eating shifted and perhaps increased pathogen pressure in the human lineage, and that healing was cognitively demanding and required new forms of cultural transmission and social exchange. And so folks like Gallo here on the right, he's a renowned opera healer, or he was, he's deceased now. His reputation spread hundreds of kilometers into the city. People would travel days to be treated by him. And I think we haven't really incorporated into evolutionary theory and then the story of evolution the importance of figures like these guys. So we humans consume huge quantities of plants that have very few nutrients, but many secondary compounds. So here's a chart of global production of spice and drug plants in 2019. Note that it's on a log scale here. At the top, I have wheat for comparison, a typical food plant. But what you can see here, so wheat is about 3/4 of a billion metric tons of production every year, but we have 100 million metric tons of onions, tens of millions of metric tons of chili peppers and garlic, coffee, tobacco, tea, cocoa, ginger, miscellaneous spices, and so forth. So the question I'll be addressing is why? Why are we such voracious consumers of plant substances that are chock full of toxins but have virtually no nutrients? And our story is going to focus on pathogens. So currently, over 9,000 pathogen species are known to infect close to 2,000 mammal host species. Here we have on the right a figure illustrating the distribution of the majority of those species, viruses, protozoa, helminths, bacteria, and arthropods across major mammalian orders here. So each mammalian host is known to be infected with between 1 and about 2,000 pathogen species, that maximum being the human species, with a median of 4 pathogen species per host species and a mean of about 16. And these are, of course, ones that are known. Each pathogen species, on the other hand, is known to infect between 1 and 176 host species, that maximum being the rabies virus, with a median of 1 host species per pathogen and a mean of about 3. And of course, these numbers are very much biased by research effort and other factors. So just to give a rough idea that Mammals are highly infected with a diverse range of different pathogens. And what we're going to argue is that the transition to carnivory in our lineage about 2 million years ago lowered the barrier to zoonotic pathogen spillover, thereby increasing pathogen pressure in the human lineage. So as most of us probably know, chimpanzees do eat vertebrate meat. So this is just a simple diagram illustrating what was likely the increase in meat eating in the human lineage about 2 million years ago. So if we take chimps as our comparison, about 10% of their diet might be vertebrate meat, the rest is plants. And if we look at modern hunter-gatherers, that's increased dramatically. It's between 40 and 60% meat. And there's even arguments that in ancestral humans, the fraction was even higher, about 70% meat. Of course, that is a figure that is contested. But if that were true, humans would be classified as high. Now, the main argument here is that when our food source incorporated increasing quantities of meat, we were, of course, exposed to invertebrate meat, and especially mammalian meat. We were exposed to mammalian pathogens at an increasing rate. So if we look at plant pathogens, so plants are often infected with mammalian pathogens from feces and other bodily fluids. And so many of those pathogens that I showed you in the previous slide are acquired by eating plants that have been infected with mammalian pathogens. But it's unlikely that we were very frequently infected with plant pathogens themselves. And the reason is, although there are known cases of infections with plant pathogens, they're quite rare. They mainly occur in immunocompromised or physically injured individuals. And the reason is that there are substantial differences between plant and animal cell walls, and differences in the immune system such that plant pathogens really aren't adapted to infect mammalian cells. So today, most human infectious diseases originate in non-human animals, a phenomenon known as spillover. So between 1940 and 2004, over 300 infectious diseases emerged in the global human population. This chart here on the right is illustrating the sources of those diseases by decades from the 1940s up to about 2000 here. And so those black diseases are non-zoonotic, but the other ones, the white and darker and lighter orange colors, are zoonotic species. The majority came from animals, mostly wildlife. Now the non-zoonotic viruses here that are newly emerging were either newly evolved strains, such as drug-resistant pathogens, or previously rare pathogens that increased in prevalence. So the main point here is that it's very common for diseases to spill over from animals into humans, at least in modern times. And just to give an example that we're all familiar with, rabies is a zoonotic virus. It infects the brain. It's transmitted from mammals to humans. There's no known cases of human-to-human transmission, except extraordinarily rare cases of organ transplants where one person was infected with rabies. If untreated, it has a 100% fatality rate. And about 29 million people every year receive a post-bite vaccination, and there are about 60,000 deaths per year, mostly from dog bites. And these are in countries that don't have strong vaccination programs for domestic dogs. Now, once a group of animals starts eating another group of animals, they tend to share pathogens. And this is just one example. So these are canid species that prey on ungulates. And so on the top here in red, we have the canid species that prey on ungulates, and in blue, canid species that do not prey on ungulates. And on the bottom in gray, we have ungulate species, and the black lines are species that share helminth parasites in common. And what you can see here is that it's much more likely that a canid species will share a helminth species with an ungulate species if it, in fact, preys on ungulates. So preying on a group of animals potentially increases your risk risk of acquiring pathogens from those prey species. And the argument here is that as humans transition from a mostly plant-based diet to a much more meat-based diet around 2 million years ago, around the start of the Pleistocene, that this would have lowered several barriers to zoonotic spillover. So what we have on the right here is an illustration of the various kinds of barriers to spillover from animals into humans. So pathogen prevalence, infection intensity, pathogen release from the reservoir host, so forth and so on. And what would have increased, or excuse me, what would have lowered the barriers to spillover is, we argue that when we started hunting animals and eating a lot of animal meat, our exposure would have increased. That's this block right here. And structural barriers, skin, there would have been more injuries. And those injuries would have, again, your skin and other structural barriers are important to preventing infections, and with scratches and bites and cuts that I'll show you in a moment here, that increases the risk of spillover. So the basic thesis here is that hunting increases the risk of zoonotic spillover. In modern humans, we have quite a bit of evidence that that is true. So bushmeat is a major risk factor for zoonotic spillover. So Ebola, HIV, monkeypox, SARS-CoV-1, and maybe SARS-CoV-2 have spilled over from bushmeat trade. A systematic review found 133 reports of disease involving 60 pathogens in 58 bushmeat species, mostly mammals, 95%, with a few reptiles and birds. And the most common zoonotic pathogens were helminths and bacteria, followed by viruses and protozoa. Also hunting, so there's increased risk of zoonotic spillover into populations that hunt for subsistence. So Congo Basin foragers, i.e. pygmies, the Aka that I work with are one example. They are at higher risk of zoonotic spillover than neighboring farmers who live in exactly the same environment. So simian foamy virus, human T lymphotrophic virus, type 1, monkeypox, Ebola, all of these are higher prevalence in, for example, Aka and other Congo Basin foragers compared to neighboring farmers. And severe bites from non-human primates are a major risk factor for infection. What we see on the right here is an Aka guy that got his nose bit off when he was hunting a gorilla. There's also evidence that veterinarians have increased zoonotic pathogen pressure, or excuse me, pathogen infections versus controls. So control groups included things like pig farmers, blood donors, non-veterinary hospital staff, veterinary students, veterinarians in non-disease risk regions, and sero-epidemiologic studies. About 84% of those studies have identified an increased risk in veterinarians compared to these controls, although 16% of the studies did not find an increased risk or even a decreased risk. Veterinarians are also infected with pathogens that are not widely recognized as zoonotic, including bovine polyomavirus and bovine norovirus, Borna disease virus, equine pneumonitis viruses, and so forth. So what's the risk out there from other mammals? Well, on average, about 10% of mammal species within the most speciose orders, such as carnivores and rodents and ungulates, are zoonotic hosts. That is, they are infected with a pathogen that is known to spill over into humans. And rodents and bats are the most speciose, and therefore they host a large fraction of zoonotic diseases. Interestingly, as we can see in this chart here, which shows the number of unique zoonoses per major mammalian order, carnivores are at the top. So even though they have only about 1/10 as many species as rodents or bats, they have equal or actually even greater numbers of pathogens that spill over. And that's interesting because humans are entering a more carnivorous niche. And it's interesting that we tend to share pathogens with other carnivores, suggesting that we might be preying on the same species and have similar vulnerabilities. Now, is there actually evidence that has happened that there have been spillovers over the course of human evolution? And in fact, yes, there are. So there are several documented cases of Pleistocene zoonotic spillovers into the human lineage. 2 to 3 million years ago, a tapeworm, Tinea species, spilled over from some African carnivore, we think probably hyenas, into the human lineage. And that's interesting because the timing of that is right around the time that the human lineage would have been interacting more with African carnivores as we both competed for the same prey species. About 1 million years ago, herpes simplex virus 2 spilled over from bonobos into the human lineage. We don't know if that's because we were hunting bonobos, but that seems to be a reasonable hypothesis for that spillover. A little later than 500,000 years ago, 400,000 years ago, human T-cell lymphotrophic virus type 2 spilled over from some primate species into humans. We're not sure what. Again, we don't really know what the circumstances were, but again, hunting seems to be a reasonable hypothesis. And then 88 to 116,000 years ago, Helicobacter pylori spilled over from some species, we don't know what, into humans. And of course, this is a major human pathogen today. Now, another indication from meat into the human lineage have been a longstanding selection pressure in the human lineage, is that animal foods appear to cause more inflammation than do plant-based foods, which actually tend to suppress inflammation. So what we have here in this chart is a systematic investigation of a very large number of studies looking for some index of inflammation versus some component of the diet, be it saturated fats, total calories, vitamin B12, iron, proteins, unsaturated fatty acids, and so forth. And what you can see here is that the foods that tend to be associated strongly with animals, like saturated fats, trans fats, cholesterol, are more likely to be associated with increased biomarkers of inflammation, whereas plant foods, fibers, polyunsaturated fatty acids, and so forth, which are more associated with plant foods, tend to be associated with lower levels of inflammation, with the zero, the dotted line here being no impact. And Alcock et al. Have proposed that these patterns are because that we have actually evolved to use things like saturated fat as cues of potential exposure to pathogens, and we preemptively upregulate inflammatory signaling, cytokine signaling, and so forth in anticipation of exposure to pathogens, whereas a lot of the plant foods are suppressing inflammation because they are actually anti-infective. Now, I think it's a stronger argument to make that carnivory probably shifted pathogen pressure in some way. And so I'll make an argument along those lines. And it may have also actually just increased it overall. And we're entertaining both of those hypotheses, both a shift without necessarily an increase and potentially an overall increase in pathogen pressure. So our evidence for a shift, these are data from on all known human RNA viruses. And in this particular study, what's called tissue tropism, the extent to which those viruses are found in different tissues in humans were coded. And what was also coded for each virus was the extent to which it transmits from human to human. And our argument here is that pathogens that have newly spilled over into humans are going to show low levels of transmission typically, either no transmission like rabies, no human-to-human transmission, or limited human-human transmission, as we often see in Ebola, or certain types of Ebola. And so we're going to take that as an index of poorly adapted to humans, whereas sustained transmission are pathogens that we'll take as a cue of pathogens being well adapted to humans. And what you can see here on the right is that most of the pathogens that or most of the RNA viruses, excuse me, that have sustained transmission tend to be found in the respiratory tract or gastrointestinal tract. And of course, those are tissues that would really support onward transmission. And they're less likely to be found in these other tissues that are less likely to support onward transmission, in particular neural tissues. So when viruses get into your brain, that's not necessarily a great tissue to support onward transmission to another host. If we look at the RNA viruses that are poorly adapted to humans, however, they often infect neural tissue. That's what we see on the left here. And then at the top in yellow, and by the way, the colors here represent the number of viruses in each of these boxes here. Viremic is infecting the blood. And so our argument here is that when pathogens are not well adapted to humans, when they're newly spilled over, they're going to basically infect a random number of tissues. And they'll often infect tissues that don't support onward transmission. They're poorly adapted. But they may also tend to, as I'll talk about later in the talk, infect tissues that have suppressed immune responses, which would also, as we'll find out, be neural tissues. So the argument here is that as humans transition to more carnivory, we may have actually had more infections of our nervous system than we did previously. And that would have been, although it wasn't good for the virus, it would have been really bad for us. Now, there's also evidence, so that previous slide was evidence for a shift in pathogen pressure, that different tissues, as we transition to meat eating, we might have experienced more infections in the brain and less, let's say, in the respiratory tract and gastrointestinal tract. But there's also evidence for an increase in pathogen pressure. So here we have zoonotic, these are specifically zoonotic viruses, grouped into 4 categories of transmission. So endemic at the top here, these would be the well-adapted viruses that easily transmit from human to human. Then in the bottom 3 rows here, we have pathogens whose onward transmission is either self-limiting or atypical or not reported at all. And what I have on the x-axis here is the case fatality rates for each of these viruses. And the size of the symbols as the number of viruses, these are basically overlapping data points. So bigger symbols mean more viruses, for example, at 0, 0 right here. And what you can see here is that well-adapted viruses tend to have relatively low case fatality rates, about 2.5% on average for the group of well-adapted zoonotic viruses. Oops. In contrast, for the poorly adapted viruses, the case fatality rates are all over the place. Again, these viruses are not well adapted to humans. They're infecting a variety of different tissues, including the brain. And so in some cases, you don't even know you're infected. You can see there's a large group of viruses here with 0 known case fatality rates. But there's also a big group at 100%. And what we see on average is about the case fatality rate, the mean case fatality rate for these poorly adapted viruses that have newly spilled over into the human lineage is about 30%. So this suggests that once we started eating meat, we might have experienced greater spillover events. And on average, this could have increased overall pathogen pressure. Now, as we shifted to a greater diet with more meat in it, this also is related to life history changes that might, in and of themselves, have also increased pathogen pressure. And one of those is body size and lifespan, or 2 of those, I should say. So in this chart, and the logic here is that large, long-lived animals are more likely to be exposed to a pathogen at some point. And so just the fact that as humans, as we evolved from presumably some Australopithecus species into early Homo, Homo ergaster, Homo erectus, we see an increase in body size and an increase later perhaps in lifespan. And here we have in this chart a large number of mammalian species plotted by the female body mass in grams on the x-axis, noted it's on a log scale here, and median female longevity on the y-axis here. And what you can see in red here up in the top is that modern humans, this is the value for modern humans, are one of the heavier mammals and also one with one of the longest lifespans. So the combination of long lifespan and large body mass may have also increased pathogen pressure in the human lineage. And basically we have to probably had to increase, as I'll argue later, our investment in immunity to basically be able to get the payoff from having a large body and a long life. We had to invest more in immunity. I'll get to that later. Okay, so is there any evidence that this is in fact true? Here's the evidence. That body size is positively associated with pathogen pressure and investment in immunity across a wide range of animals. So a meta-analysis across animal, plant, and fungal hosts found that body size was a strong positive predictor of pathogen richness, i.e. diversity in most hosts, including mammals for all classes of pathogens. Body size was positively associated with the prevalence of microparasites, viruses, and bacteria in primates and ungulates, and with the prevalence of macroparasites in primates and carnivores. Neutrophils, which are part of the innate immune system, i.e. concentrations, actually go up with body mass, whereas lymphocytes, which participate in both innate and adaptive immune systems, scaled about isometrically. So as body mass goes up, concentration stayed about the same. Antibacterial activity in serum against 3 bacterial species in over 160 terrestrial mammals found that antibacterial activity scaled isometrically with body size. So as body size goes up, the activity actually goes up per unit cell. Carnivory-related demographic changes, in addition to these life history changes, might have increased pathogen pressure as well, although some changes may have also decreased it. So specifically, range size is also positively associated with pathogen pressure. So host range size was a positive predictor of pathogen diversity in all hosts except arthropods for all classes of pathogens in a meta-analysis across animal, plant, and fungal hosts. And the range size of early Homo species are estimated to be about 7 to 10 times larger than those of Australopithecus. So the logic here is that as we began exploiting much larger areas, we are again going to come into contact with many more pathogens. And that's what this meta-analysis Kamiya et al. Found. So our increase in range size probably also increased pathogen pressure in the human lineage as we transitioned from Australopithecus to Homo and a greater use of meat. However, this probably also reduced population density, and that would have reduced pathogen pressure. So in the lower chart here, what you can see is that there's a negative association between the amount of hunted meat in the diet and population density. So these 2 factors would have perhaps balanced each other out. Now, if all of this is true, if humans, as we transitioned to a greater proportion of meat in our diet, and if this did increase pathogen pressure or at least shift it, then we should see evidence that pathogen defenses in humans diverge from those in chimps and other primates, and also be able to link those to carnivory. And indeed, there is evidence of this. So here we have stomach pH, how acid your stomach is. So on the vertical axis here is stomach pH. Low values indicate high levels of acidity, higher values indicate low acidity. These are a large number of bird, mammal, non-primate mammal, and primate species. Each dot here is one primate species. And they are categorized by their main types of diet. And what you can see is that over here on the far right, herbivores tend to have a relatively, sorry about this, Herbivores tend to have relatively high stomach pH, so not very acid. Whereas over on the left, scavengers and carnivores tend to have an extremely acidic stomach. And the idea here is that stomach pH is a pathogen defense. It's one of the main barriers to pathogens in the gut, probably also helps denature proteins and so forth. And you can see here in the red dot that humans have an exceptionally low, i.e. exceptionally acidic stomach pH, very much on par with generalist carnivores and obligate and facultative scavengers. So as far as our stomach pH goes, we seem to have a high investment in pathogen defenses there. Another major change is in sialic acid biology. These are, so basically our cells are coated with polysaccharides, and in primates and mammals, these are terminated, these polysaccharides are terminated with sialic acids that are coded for by various genes. And about 2 million years ago, there was a loss of function mutation in a CMAH gene that eliminated the biosynthesis of a common mammalian sialic acid, which happened to be a target for various pathogens such as Plasmodium and E. coli and various coronaviruses. And this would have changed the surfaces. So as we all know, pathogens, viruses and other pathogens gain access to cells. They have to interact with the surface proteins. So this would have changed surface proteins throughout our bodies. And then this loss of this gene coding for the sialic acid then selected for a number of what are called cyclic genes. These are proteins that interact with surface cell proteins that bind sialic acids. So these are a lot of signaling proteins. And what you can see in the diagram here on the left is that in the human lineage, after our divergence from chimpanzees, but prior to the divergence of Neanderthals and Denisovans, that there were a large number of changes in the human lineage in these genes, in contrast to very few changes in other great apes. And so the folks that have been working on this suggest that it was, in fact, given the timing of these changes, that these are likely protecting humans from increased exposure to zoonotic pathogens spilling over from prey animals. Another piece of evidence is that there are divergent immune responses to bacterial and viral stimuli. So it turns out the human immune system is highly sensitive to LPS. This is lipopolysaccharide. This is a common component of bacterial cell walls. And we have detectors that detect LPS as a cue of bacterial infections. And we typically mount a pretty strong, not only us, but a wide range of mammals and birds, mount a pretty strong immune response when it detects LPS. What we have in the chart here on the right is the quantities of LPS, the minimum quantities necessary to stimulate an immune response in a wide variety of species. And what you can see here is that humans are extraordinarily sensitive. We require very tiny quantities of LPS in order to trigger an immune response that is equivalent to that of a macaque. And it's about 1/10 of those needed. So something's going on here. And again, the folks that put together this data are arguing that our extraordinary sensitivity to LPS is again due to the increased exposure to microorganisms from increased butchering and eating of meat in early Homo. And that's also linked to the biology I was just talking about, the cingulate biology. There's evidence for divergent downregulation of anthrax toxin receptor 2. So this encodes a widely expressed transmembrane receptor protein. And this is the receptor protein that aids entry of anthrax toxin into cells. Anthrax, of course, is another deadly zoonotic disease. And the expression of this receptor is downregulated about 8-fold in human immune cells compared to non-human primates, and experimentally upregulating this gene increases cellular vulnerability to anthrax toxins. So the folks who did this study conclude that the transition to meat eating, again, anthrax spills over from ungulates, increased our exposure to anthrax, selecting for reduced expression of this receptor that is now fixed in humans. And there are other divergent genes related to meat eating immunity, divergent apolipoprotein E, divergent, we have a highly divergent salivary proteome compared to other great apes, again linked to some of the immunoglobulins and other immune related molecules in saliva. Okay, so that is evidence that we are, that pathogen pressure either shifted or perhaps increased in the human lineage as we shifted to meat eating. And now what I'm going to talk about is the potential cognitive and behavioral adaptations to zoonotic pathogens rather than the cellular and genetic changes. And let me just quickly check my time. Brian, could you quickly tell me my time here?
Yeah, you're at 12:41, so that means you have quite a bit of time.
Okay. Okay. So I want to draw two distinctions here in the immune system, in the arms of the immune system. And this is a widely used framework that looks at immune components of the immune system as either constitutive, which would be over to the right in the figure here. And what that means is that these things are always on, regardless of pathogen exposure. And that means you pay a fixed cost for them. So examples would be natural antibodies or complement proteins, your skin, for example, pH in your stomach. We have a number of constitutive defenses that are always active, and we're always investing in them. And the advantage of those is that they're going to prevent exponential pathogen growth. They're going to have a really early, they're going to detect pathogens quickly, deal with the threat early on so that you're not dealing with exponential pathogen growth if they work. The downside is you have to pay a cost for them whether you're exposed or not. Inducible defenses, on the other hand, only activate upon contact with the pathogen. So this would be things like fever and the acute phase response, antibody production, and so forth. So the advantage is you only pay for them when you need them. The disadvantage is that there's a delay, and that delay allows pathogen growth, thereby requiring an ultimately very expensive immune response to get rid of a much larger population of pathogens. And so what I'm going to argue is, or what I'm going to do here is extend that framework. Oh, one thing I forgot to say is we also have this other vertical axis here, which would be non-specific responses like fever, complement proteins that are active against a wide variety of different pathogens versus much more specific responses like specific antibodies and B and T cells. So that's a second axis of variation in the immune system. What I'm going to do is extend that framework to behavioral immunity. As most of us probably know, behavioral immunity is conceiving that behavioral strategies can also protect us from pathogens. And what I'm going to argue is that we have a constitutive behavioral immunity in the form of daily spice use and daily recreational, quote unquote, drug use. And we also have an inducible behavioral immunity in the form of traditional plant-based medicines. The idea here is that the local flora over human evolution, we could conceptualize it as a pharmacy. So plants are infected and eaten by the same broad classes of organisms that infect humans. So the plant kingdom contains an estimated 100,000 to 1 million unique chemically unique structures, approximately 5,000 to 15,000 chemical structures per plant species. Most chemical diversity comprises lineage-specific compounds involved in plant defense and plant pollinator signaling. So all of those structures are different compounds that have evolved and exist in those plants because they have effectively protected those plants from some kind of pathogen or parasite or herbivore that might also attack us humans. And so we and many others have argued that humans and other animals have evolved to co-opt all of these plant defensive chemicals to protect ourselves from the same broad classes of pathogens. And so the argument here is that daily spice use is a constitutive behavioral immune defense. So spices are anti-infective. There's actually evidence that chimpanzees, when they have freshly killed a monkey, will eat that meat with fresh leaves, and at least one interpretation of that behavior is it's somewhat analogous to adding spices to your meat dish. As I'll show you in a minute, there's evidence for medicinal plants in Neanderthal dental calculus. There's quite a bit of evidence that across cultures, spices are widely used. The number of spices and the quantity of spices does vary, but as the chart I showed you at the very beginning of the talk shows, spices are extraordinarily popular, and we produce millions of metric tons of them every year. We also have some evidence for archaeological evidence for spice use in the late Mesolithic. And we also have substantial evidence for spice use among Congo Basin foragers. So spice use appears to be a human universal. Now what we have in this plot here is data from a study that's a broad literature search that looked for any study that involved any spice and any health outcome. And then coded whether the association was positive or negative, i.e. did the spice have a positive impact on health or a negative impact on health. So there were about over 8,000 positive spice health associations. We have those on the left and in purple, and 783 negative associations, those are in red. And so what you can see here on the left, these are just a number of different results supporting either a positive or negative health association. So large numbers of positive associations with various spices in glucose metabolism disorders, brain diseases, that's pretty interesting, intestinal diseases, neurological manifestations, inflammation, dementia. We do see some negative. The biggest negative here is hypersensitivity, allergic type reactions to the spice, dermatitis, asthma, various things like that. So there are some negatives, but what we can see here is at least the studies have much more often found positive associations than negative ones. Obviously, it could easily be biased research effort and publication effort and so forth and so on. Over on the right here, we see which particular spices often have positive or negative associations. So garlic, ginger, turmeric, licorice. These all have lots of positive associations. Interesting, licorice had about as many negative associations as positive: fennel, saffron, cinnamon, so forth and so on. Bottom line here is there's quite a bit of evidence for positive impacts of health, of spices on health in a wide variety of health domains. We argue that traditional medicine, in contrast to spices, which are incorporated into largely meat dishes every day, and thus would be conceptualized as a constitutive defense, traditional medicine we might conceptualize as a behavioral inducible defense, excuse me. It's plant-based, so there are an estimated 374,000 plant species, 28,000 of them, 7.5%, are used in traditional medicine. And we might think of this as something that really is no longer important, but actually it is. about 85% of the world's population lives in low and middle income countries where access to Western medicine is pretty limited. And these populations still today rely very heavily on traditional medicines. And there's been quite a few studies now in small scale societies that have found that knowledge of traditional medicine is associated with improved health outcomes. Going backward in time, we do have some evidence for Neanderthal self-medication. So this is a study of dental calculus, Neanderthal dental calculus. You can see an example of that over on the right here, that kind of band around the enamel there is dental calculus. And in this study, they extracted DNA from Neanderthal dental calculus, seeing what was in there. And of course, there were food-based plants, wheat, pathogens. There was, interestingly, evidence for an intracellular parasite, DNA of the parasite in there, a gastrointestinal parasite. In this is one particular Neanderthal individual who also had a dental infection. And interestingly, there was, evidence for penicillin DNA in the dental calculus, and also aspirin, poplar tree DNA sequences, which have aspirin in them, or the poplar tree does. So this is one interpretation of this anyway, is that this person had both a gastrointestinal parasite and a dental infection, and may have been self-medicating with plant substances that contain, or actually fungal, one was a fungus, penicillin, and a plant-based substance, aspirin. Okay, we propose that discovering these, now remember, our ancestors didn't have any notion of germ theory of disease. People just got sick. Some plants seem to help in some cases. So discovering these plants and the kinds of plant, which plant might and which plant part might have treated which symptoms or which illnesses would have been cognitively demanding and might have been an important selection pressure on human cognition. Just to illustrate, let's say we had 20 plants and 10 illnesses, and we wanted to know which plant was effective for which illness. That would take 200 different tests if you systematically went through each of those. However, combinations of drugs often outperform single drugs. And so what I have here on the right is a study that was looking at Chinese medicine, and specifically treatments for those tinea tapeworms that I talked about earlier. And it found that a combination of areca seeds and pumpkin seeds outperformed either one individually. And so finding combinations of plant compounds would have been even more cognitively demanding. There are 190 combinations of 2 plant substances chosen from 20. So testing each combination against 10 illnesses would require almost 2,000 tests as compared to 200 tests to just test one plant. So how did the Chinese healers discover that it was this combination of these 2 seeds that was most effective against this tapeworm? That took a lot of work. So this is a study that my former grad student Aaron Leitner did on knowledge specialization in traditional societies. He used the HRAF, extracted 547 text records from 47 different cultures. These are those cultures here. And he analyzed them for evidence of knowledge specialists. And what he found is that knowledge specialists were almost always medical specialists. So there was specialization in other areas like anatomy or geography or marriage or law. But the size of each of these dots is the number of text records that he found for folks specializing in each of these different areas: subsistence, arts and crafts. And what you can see is the biggest dot here is medicine. And then these links are where knowledge specialists, where there was evidence in these ethnographic texts of specialists specializing in multiple domains. So each link here, and what you can see is that medical specialization is linked to botany and zoology and injury and psychology. So knowledge specialization is very closely associated with medical knowledge specialization. And so our argument here is, now these medical specialists, these would be things like shamans and traditional healers, like the Gallo that I showed you a picture of at the beginning. And it takes a lot of work to master all that. So Gallo was the major healer in this group of Aka that I worked with. He did have folks that were training with him, and people would literally come from hundreds of kilometers around to be treated by him. So to make that work, mastering this traditional medicine was a substantial investment, and mastering subsistence skills is also a substantial investment. But there's a big difference between subsistence skills and medical skills. So subsistence skills like hunting, food preparation, gathering, these are personally useful to everybody every day. Medical skills are not personally useful to every person every day. So Gallo is not getting sick every day or every week or even every month with different illnesses. His medical knowledge is only going to pay off for him if he can use it to treat other people. So that profiting from medical expertise would have required cultivating a large clientele, some of whom would become sick with some illnesses on some days, and then exchanging your medical services for various forms of payment, be they kin investment or resource exchange or services exchange or what have you. So what we're arguing is, in contrast to some of the stuff that's been put together by Rob Boyd, Pete Richardson, and Joe Henrik, which really heavily emphasize the importance of culturally transmitted subsistence skills. We do think these medical skills are also relying on cultural transmission, but the dynamics have a distinct. And when we look at ethnomedical specialists in these cultures, we do find that, and I don't want to, due to time, going to go dig into this chart too much, but there's quite a bit of evidence that they are market specialists, that they are trading their knowledge with other folks. They are known for being efficacious healers. Occasionally, they are prestigious mentors and teachers, and it's pretty rare that they're not seen as efficacious. They're almost always seen as efficacious. And interestingly, this is a separate project, but there's a lot of supernatural stuff going on here too. I won't talk about that today. And when we look at the evidence in the ethnographic record for the incentives versus disincentives to patronize these folks, basically, people see them as offering genuine benefits, these shamans and healers. They do have a reputation for being efficacious. They help with uncommon and serious problems. And patronage of them is based on their efficacy and evidence of success. And there's quite a bit of evidence against the fact that they offer their services for free. They're almost always trading their services for some kind of benefit in return. And when we kind of do a cluster analysis of all these guys, we find basically three types of shamans or healers or knowledge specialists. What I've been talking about are these efficacious healers over here that often confer benefits in exchange for payments. We do find folks that are prestigious teachers. This would be more similar to the standard Boyd Richardson Henrik story. Prestige bias learning, for example. Then we find maybe what's more the kind of more common stereotype out there of these guys, that they some of them do seem to use supernatural methods to instill fear in other folks. This was the less common. We call these guys the feared diviners. So the folks that we're focusing on are only one type of at least three different types of these medical knowledge specialists. Okay, final segment of the talk here is on the brain. Remember, pathogens that newly spill over often infect a lot of different tissues that aren't good for the pathogen, but also really horrible for us. And the brain is one of those. And one of the reasons might be that a brain immune defenses really differ substantially from those in peripheral organs and tissues. Just to remind you, brain size is increasing dramatically in the human lineage, starting about when we transition to meat eating. So these are all different fossils, different hominins and humans, and this is brain size on the vertical axis. And so this is just the standard story that we're all familiar with. And we needed to, as brain size increased, the importance of protecting this brain, which is so critical to human fitness over a much longer lifespan, is really critical. Now, why is the immune system and immune defenses, why are they constrained in the brain? Well, just to give an example, herpes simplex virus, when it infects your skin cells and you get a cold sore, the way your body reacts to that is massive immune and virus-mediated cell death. You basically kill all those cells and then replace them. You can't do that in the brain. The brain mostly cannot replace neurons. There's very little evidence, with maybe one exception, of neurogenesis in the brain in adulthood. So if you have a brain infection, you can't respond to it by killing infected brain cells. You can't replace those brain cells, and you will also lose any information or functionality that are stored in those neurons. So the brain is what's referred to often as immune privileged to a considerable extent. This doesn't mean that it doesn't have a lot of immune defenses, it does, but basically it's not going to respond with a massive amount of inflammation, unlike a skin infection or infection of many other of your tissues. And so one of the big defenses that the brain has is the blood-brain barrier. This prevents many pathogens from reaching the brain in the first place. But it also somewhat has a trade-off in that it also prevents a lot of toxins from getting into the brain, specifically drugs that might be able to treat those brain infections. So treating brain infections is extremely difficult because it's difficult to get antibiotics to treat brain cancers. We have a very effective system for keeping both pathogens and toxins out of the brain, but drugs are viewed by the blood-brain barrier as toxins, so they're often kept out too. Interestingly, recreational drugs do cross the blood-brain barrier. That's why they are recreational drugs. Ethanol, nicotine, caffeine readily diffuse across the blood-brain barrier. So let me just give an interesting example of this. This is the Tinea tapeworm that spilled over from probably hyenas into the human lineage 2 to 3 million years ago. And it infects a lot of tissue, including the brain. So we humans are the definitive hosts. And the typical cycle is it's in our gut and laying eggs, and we poop out the eggs. Those eggs are eaten by pigs. The oncospheres then get into, and the cysts get into the different tissues in the pig, the muscle, the brain. We eat the pig, and the cycle starts over again. However, sometimes these tapeworm cysts cross the gastrointestinal tract and infect other tissues, including the brain. And so that's what we see here in this image right here. All these black spots are cysts from Tinea tapeworms infecting a human brain. And we're not sure how often this happens, but it might happen in as many as 10 to 20% of the cases. Now, in Western medicine, we treat this tapeworm with a compound known as auricillene hydrobromide, among other drugs. It turns out that because this tapeworm has been with us a long time, traditional medicine also has treatments for it. And one of those treatments is areca seeds, which contain, surprise, surprise, high concentrations of auricillene. Here's the areca palm right here up in the upper right. And very interestingly, one of the most popular recreational drugs in much of Asia and the Pacific It's probably the fourth most popular drug in the world after caffeine, alcohol, and nicotine, is betel nut. And betel nut is largely areca seeds, arecanut, which have high quantities of arecaline, and that is actually the addictive psychoactive component of betel nut. So interestingly, one of the most popular recreational drugs is giving your brain a big dose of arecaline, which is exactly the drug that can kill these guys, which do infect the brain and probably have for 2 to 3 million years. The final part of our argument is that, again, like spices, recreational drugs may be a constitutive defense. These things cross the blood-brain barrier, could have treated pathogens that newly spilled over into the human lineage and actually got into our brains. And what we see here is that virtually every human will transition to psychoactive drug use in adolescence. So on the x-axis here, we have age. On the y-axis, we have the proportion of folks who use this drug that have used it by that age. And what you can see is there's almost no drug use in young kids between 0 and 10. And then there's a very rapid transition so that almost anybody who's going to use alcohol or tobacco or cannabis or caffeine starts to use it in between age 10 and age 20 here. Interestingly, all popular recreational drugs are toxic to helminths. And this same pattern, these are obviously high, industrialized countries. Every different color here is a different country here. So you can see this is a really common pattern across cultures, this transition to drug use in adolescence. We also found it in the Aka, in males anyway. Here's an Aka woman drawing Mutunga leaves. This is a local plant that they smoke when tobacco is not available. Here we have their cannabis use, tobacco use, no use in kids, and then in males at least, a very dramatic, rapid transition to cannabis use and tobacco use in adolescence and adulthood. In fact, virtually all Aka men smoke tobacco and almost all of them smoke cannabis. I've outlined that whole story in a number of other publications. I'm just throwing those up here. The argument that these recreational drugs might be effective against helminths, and that might be why we use them. To conclude, carnivory shifted and perhaps increased zoonotic pathogen pressure in the human lineage about 2 million years ago. Plant-based pharmaceuticals were an important behavioral immune defense in the form of spices, traditional medicine, and recreational drugs. Discovering plant-based treatments of ever-evolving pathogens was a cognitively challenging and therefore strong selection pressure on human cognitive abilities, we propose. And therefore, in the story of human evolution, which has really long mostly featured hunters, healers like this guy had an equally important role to play. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Ed. We're all clapping here. It would be thunderous applause if you were here in person, as we wish. If anyone has questions or comments for Ed, just please raise your hand in the chat window. We did it that way last week and it seemed to work great. So please put up those hands, and then Ed, you can, if you see the participants list like I do, you should be able to field those folks who have raised their hands.
Got it. Let's start with Andrew there.
Hi, excuse me. Thanks for a really interesting talk. I just wanted to know if there was any evidence that you've come across in the archaeological record suggesting that there's sort of a tight fit between the advent of animal husbandry and the cultivation of plant products that are, you know, tightly matched to the sorts of parasites to which those who are cultivating those animals might be exposed to?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I haven't thought of that, so I haven't looked that up. I'm going to write these down so I can look that up. So I'll just generally say that the transition to domesticated species, animal species, and plant species, that's where most anthropologists have looked for this increase in pathogen pressure.
Mhm.
So it's often referred to as the first epidemiological transition. We're now exposed to large numbers of livestock, high population densities. And so most anthropologists have linked this first epidemiological transition to about 10,000 years ago. And we are pushing it way back that the first quote unquote epidemiological transition for humans was actually about 2.5 million years ago. But so there has been quite a bit of research on spillovers from domesticated animals into humans. So there's quite a bit of evidence for that. In fact, a lot of diseases that we have today do seem, in fact, there's a back and forth from humans to domesticated animals and from domesticated animals to humans. And that's where most of the research is. So there's quite a bit of evidence that domesticating animals is a risk factor for zoonotic disease, but I don't know of anybody that's looked at, was that combined with domestication of plant medicines? That's a great question. And so I'll be sure to look that up, but I don't have an answer for you, sorry.
Cool,
Any
thank you.
follow up on that? No, okay, Delaney.
Hi, thanks for a very interesting talk. I really enjoyed it. I had 2 questions. The first one was about this first point and your first aggregation of evidence with hunting and all these pathogen pressure shifting. If you saw that evidence as also support for humans as scavengers, and if not, why not?
Yeah, so I generally, when I use the word hunting, I basically just mean meat eating. So it could be scavenging. My understanding of carnivory is that there's really not a clean separation between scavenging and hunting, that top predators like lions and wolves scavenge, and several hyena species typically conceptualized as scavengers often hunt. So there's really kind of a continuum of strategies in this. When do you get access to the carcass? And there's been quite a bit of recent research on that and debate. I think everybody agrees that scavenging is definitely part of the story. But there's been some new evidence that really humans had primary access to the carcass, or much earlier access than many people have thought earlier in our evolutionary history. But I'm not a super expert on all the evidence. Don't think it bears too heavily on our story, except that I think as we are hunting, we're going to be interacting not only with prey species, but carnivore species that are competing for those same carcasses. So it may be the case that the spillover from hyenas to humans come when we're, when we're contesting, confronting hyenas at their kill, or maybe even hunting hyenas. So I think there's just going to be a lot of interaction between carnivores and humans and prey species that didn't exist before in a kind of a complicated mix. Does that answer your question?
Right. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then my second question was about the age curves and the recreational drug use. And I was just wondering if you could talk about that in relation to the idea that a lot of times helminth infections are most risky for children, especially with wasting and like developmental growth problems.
Yeah. So, yeah. That's a great question. And in fact, we do link these curves in some of our papers to the peak curves in helminth infection. So of course, children are born without helminth infections, and then they generally acquire them through childhood. And what we see is that peak worm burden generally occurs in kind of middle to late childhood or early adolescence. So that would be when we might expect the transition to drug use based on that story. But there's a cost to these drugs. These drugs are psychoactive, they interfere with neural signaling. And so there's a trade-off from whatever medicinal benefits you might have from, let's say, plant a recreational drug, to the teratogenic effects and disrupting brain development. So we have quite a bit of evidence that until about the age of 10, there's almost no psychoactive drug use in kids. It's extremely rare. And our argument for that is that it would interfere with rapidly developing brains. And many of these drugs, like nicotine, nicotine interferes with acetylcholine signaling, and acetylcholine signaling is critical for brain development. And because of the risk of smoking in pregnancy, there's been a ton of research in rat and rodent models of the impacts of nicotine on developing mammalian brain. There's quite a profound negative impact. So we argue that the kids have evolved to be averse to bitter plant substances and psychoactive substances until their brains are largely developed, which is around age 10 or so. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Theodore.
Yeah, hi Ed, thanks for a really interesting talk. So my question is a little half-formed. I'm not sure if it's kind of open-ended, but in thinking about the the role of healers and the case for specialization and healing being important over human evolution, it makes me think about cooking specialization and the relationship between the tastiness of particular foods and their potential health properties in relation to these spices and other foods. And so coming to the kind of open-ended nature of the question, I'm not really sure if I have any specific thoughts about it, but I'm wondering if you've thought about that and whether whether cooking specialization might be part of the story.
I do think so. In fact, a lot of the spillover is here. Not in the hunting of the animal necessarily, but in the butchering and processing of it. So this is a point where I think there would have been a lot of selection pressure for the food preparation stage, looking for evidence of infection and avoiding exposure. So in that regard, and then how do we learn all those spices and which ones, and why do some spices taste good? It's not clear. So there's maybe an innate part of this too, but I think there could be equally a cognitive demand on figuring out which spices to use with meats, which ones would have been the most effective in the local environment. The slight difference there would be that this would be knowledge that would probably be widespread in the population. Everybody is going to be wanting to use this on a regular basis, unlike the traditional medical knowledge. So I think this story might kind of more closely align with the standard kind of Boyd Richardson Henrik story for cultural evolution of spice use, where it's going to be a more widely beneficial form of knowledge. That's about as far as I've thought of it.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Thanks.
Sure. Dan.
Hi, Ed. Also, hi, Nikki. Hi, Roger. Good to see you all. Really interesting stuff. Just picking up on the last point, I'm a little puzzled why you're drawing such a stark distinction between a kind of dual inheritance, what you're identifying as a Boyd and Richardson model and what I take you're propounding. Because, I mean, the fact that thousands of possible combinations exist, that there's a huge, data processing problem, that doesn't mean that traditional healers actually, invent new medicines. That is, that they're not necessarily experimentalists. Probably most of what they do is learn tradition, and maybe then they stand on the shoulders of giants and they add a little bit of knowledge based on their own lifetime of practical experience. But isn't that a cultural evolution story? I mean, it's just that the information is not, is not being transmitted broadly within the community, but that's consistent with the highly demanding nature of the learning, such that you get a division of labor. So I'm just curious. I don't think that you think that efficacious traditional healers are starting de novo and creating their own pharmacopoeia with each generation. Surely you think that they're, if anything, just maybe slightly refining a large body of cultural knowledge that must be the product of cultural evolution.
Yeah, absolutely. So we absolutely agree that this is a cultural transmission story. And it's more, does it maybe, instead of differing quality, well, the differences that we see is that we have quite a bit of evidence that healers keep their knowledge proprietary. So they don't share their knowledge. And unlike the Henrik Lloyd Richardson story, where you trade respect and prestige for proximity to learn, what we see instead with the healers is you trade a treatment for some kind of payment. So if you go to the doctor and get treated, you don't become a better doctor. In fact, you may have no idea what the doctor did. What you're doing is you're going to the doctor to get some medicine or some treatment, and you give them some money or something. And so that part is different. So we do absolutely think there's cultural transmission. We absolutely agree that healers have obtained the vast majority of their knowledge from folks that they learn from. But there's going to be differences, we think, in how you profit from it. You're going to trade services for it, trade medical services for various kinds of payment. And we also think that the training is going to be different. Instead of everybody acquiring some widely used hunting skill or food preparation skill, you're going to have a very few people who are going to be your acolytes. So yes, it's going to be a cultural transmission story, but one with at least a different flavor than the standard story of the transmission of subsistence practices. How much is that going to change stuff? We don't know yet. We think we have to do some modeling here to really understand, is that going to be kind of a big difference, or is it really just going to be change the story, kind of tweak it a bit around the edges? We're not sure yet, to be frank.
Yeah, so I see Clark has his hand up, and I'm reading Clark's mind. I'm guessing that he's going to have ideas about intellectual property, and he knows a lot more about that than I do. But a couple of other remarks on the substance of your talk. So one thing, I'm on board with the program. I agree with you entirely about the kind of mixed bag that meat eating constitutes. And one piece of evidence that adds to your story, but that which at least here you didn't include, is the fact that conditioned food aversions preferentially target proteinaceous foods, in particular animal product foods, right? So that's consistent with, with there being selection on, at least on, generalists that include a lot of animal products in their diet, like, rats, for example, as well as ourselves. Not just to focus on, ubiquitous plant toxins, but to pay particular attention to the dangers that animal products pose.
Yeah, we're in 100% agreement on that.
And then I just have an empirical question, because I'm puzzled, and that was on the stomach pH slide. I noticed that dog, if we assume that, first of all, that canids in general are eating a lot of meat and probably scavenging quite a lot of rotten meat, something that potentially makes scavenging even more dangerous than hunting. And then domestic dogs, presumably, they've got it even worse from the pathogen perspective, because they consume human feces and, a variety of kinds of offal from human consumption that probably have very high pathogen content. So, how is it? And dogs can clearly eat, carrion that would make even a robust human quite ill. So, what's going on with dogs that they have such a high stomach pH?
Yeah, dogs and cats have kind of a high stomach pH, and I don't know. I noticed that too, and I have a little check mark in my brain to follow up on that. I have not followed up on that, but I agree that is an interesting question. I think dogs are less carnivorous than we think, and they actually express some amylases in saliva that wolves do not, that suggest starch metabolism and starch. So they are not as carnivorous as we think, but I agree. I was surprised to see dogs as an outlier here.
Sure, but they're exposed to human pathogens, ad nauseum, right? I mean,
oh yeah. So yeah, I don't know. I agree. It's a good question. I don't have an answer, but I do want to follow up on that. I just haven't had a chance to yet.
All right, cool stuff.
Yep, thanks, Clark.
Hey Ed, thanks for the talk. I had a question about the distinction between sort of knowledge specialization as a continuum versus a category, because you seem to be treating it in some of these analyses as categorical. And obviously, I mean, there's probably not a stark contrast there, but I guess I was wondering what you think about the Schwarr case, where from what I've seen, you know, there's the what we would call shamans or Wishin and Schwarr, you know, are healers, but their healing methods don't usually use, they only use hallucinogens. They're not using these kinds of treatments that you're talking about. And the people and what you're calling plant medicinal knowledge, things that would help to clear an infection or a headache or something like that. Pretty much everyone, all adults have knowledge of those plants and how to administer them. But I mean, I would see it as similar. I would see it as similar to hunting in that all adults have hunting knowledge, but there's not a categorical distinction between the good and the bad hunters. There are some people that you would say, well, that guy really is the top expert or whatever. And I'm sure the same exists with plant knowledge, but it's not categorical, although Wishin's is definitely a categorical distinction. So do you think the Schwarr are an outlier in that sense? And I mean, I actually think that some of the related groups like Quechua in this area have the same kind of thing. So I was just curious what you think there.
So a couple thoughts. One is, I wish Aaron Leitner was here because he did all the reading and coding of all this, and I did not. So he would be able to answer your question better than I could. But I will say that I first of all, I think there are some medical conditions that are going to be pretty common. And so I think where we might modify our story, you know, there's a lot of childhood diseases that are really common. And what we would expect is that parents, maybe especially moms, are going to know what to do. And all moms, or most moms, are going to know. So I agree with you that we're going to see more of a continuum here. And actually the research that has quantified medical knowledge in a number of small scale societies, Congo Basin foragers and others, Chimane, does find more of a continuum. You can quantify levels of knowledge. So I think there's a lot of value to not making it as categorical as we did in reality. We're kind of limited because we're coding text records from the HRAF. And
right.
I don't know if you've ever done this, but they're really, the texts are fragmentary and scattered. You're not getting a long treatise on knowledge specialization. You're reading about something else, and in passing, they talk about,
right,
you know, a knowledge specialist. So we really are forced to code things in a binary way. Is there any evidence for knowledge specialization or not? We're not really in a position, with very rare exception.
I mean, that raises another kind of thing. I mean, I've been pretty skeptical of how much we use the HRAF for things, especially because of the colonial source of it. And you know, here it might actually, I don't know that much about it, but you could imagine that it could produce a bias towards a more categorical phenomenon, because, you know, if you think about, if you wanted to find out in Wales or in Scotland who the medicinal experts were, it would very much be categorical, right? There'd be like one person in the village where they would know traditional remedies or something like that now, right? And so I think that maybe in some of these areas, it could be similar, where Christianity and the spread of Western medicine and things like that have made it so that the traditional knowledge is crowded into a smaller number of individuals that you might not have seen. You know.
Yeah, I think that's possible. I think there's also that ethnographers are going to be biased. They're looking for social roles from the get-go. Almost all of the knowledge specialists were males. I think that's highly unlikely. So they just may have been ignoring all the knowledge in moms, for example, and women. So I do agree with you that the ethnographic record has a lot of different biases that we have to be careful of. So
yeah. Cool. Okay. Thanks.
Yep. Somebody had their hand up and then it went away.
I did, but I recognize that we're sort of close to the end, and I don't want to keep people here for, you know, too much longer. But I can say anything ask you afterwards.
So I'm happy to keep answering questions, but if we need to wrap things up, that's great too.
Well, Andrew, why don't you field your question. I think we should be mindful, but it's all right if you want to carry on this conversation. If Ed's open to it, why don't you go for it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm not an expert by any means in, infection risk at sort of different stages of, processing, animals for consumption, but presumably, to the extent that something like cooking can denature proteins and thus, reduce risks at certain stages, as you are, hunting and then processing the carcass and then cooking it, there might be differential risks of infection for different things at different stages. So is there any evidence to suggest that something like hunting practices or hunting magic orient hunters towards consumption of particular types of plant products to reduce infection in a sort of risk specific way?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know of anything like that. We do have that one example of chimpanzees using particular leaves and eating those leaves with monkeys they've just killed. I don't know of any examples of that in humans. I think it's a good and interesting question. A lot of the risk in the hunting process comes from bites. So you get bitten by the prey. And then a lot of the risk when you're butchering it is you end up, getting cut or scratched. And so at least this is the thinking, that some of the spillover is happening due to kind of actual accidental injuries from the butchering process here. But in terms of incorporating different plants or specialized plants at different parts of that process, it's again, an interesting question that I don't have any evidence for, but I'll keep an eye out. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking sort of along the lines of some of the things, some of the comments Dan had been making, thinking about the, cognitive richness of the problem that this sort of evidence would be strongly supportive of the kinds of claims that you're making, as opposed to just sort of a raw cultural evolution type account.
Yeah, more focused and more specialized examples of this, I think agree would help. I will say that a lot of the literature on this is really focused on the cooking story. This is not exactly your question, but obviously cooking would play a major role in reducing spillover or infections. And we do think that that is obviously an extreme, one of the major benefits of cooking is that you do kill a lot of the pathogens. But I was kind of surprised that there's kind of ignored this part of it, that the spillover from the hunting process itself and the butchering process, which cooking will not. So the impression you get when you read through a lot of the literature is that cooking is going to solve all these problems. And one of our main messages is no, it doesn't. There's plenty of opportunities for spillover long before you start cooking this stuff. And we even see that in populations that do cook meat, hunting and gather populations, they are at increased risk of spillover, even though they're thoroughly cooking their meat. So the cooking story, I think, has been overemphasized, even though, yes, it is absolutely important part of the story.
I think if I can just chime in here, while I think cooking clearly is important, importantly, including by virtue of changes in the nutritional content of the product itself, independent of any sanitizing effects. But it's very easy for for people living in weird societies with weird kitchens to overestimate how much preparation processes and cooking can sanitize meat products, right? I mean, if you don't have hot water and soap and dishwashing detergent, then this woman that you're showing in the photograph here, what's going to happen after she's cooked the food? Well, she's probably not going to go wash her hands before she serves that food, right? So I think it doesn't discount the importance of cooking to say Yeah, but there's still a lot of opportunity for transmission, even once you have a full-blown cooking, cultural architecture in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also have quite a bit of ethnographic evidence and systematic evidence that hunters consume stuff before they get back to camp. So there's a fair amount of eating of raw meat and so forth. So
Yeah.
And that's another thing. A lot of the emphasis is on kind of rotting meat. And again, I think there's too much evidence on putrid meat as being a big risk, as opposed to spillover from pathogens that are already adapted to mammals that might be relatively closely related to you already, like apes and other primates.
Could I ask you, Ed, you mentioned two different things in this conversation. You mentioned the risk factor associated specifically with biting. And also you mentioned the possibility of some gender differences. And just to put into the mix also, the data you showed of use of cannabis and tobacco showed such a strong sex difference. And so these little lines of evidence, for me, they don't add up. And I was hoping you could kind of unpack it for me, because if I'm not mistaken, I remember accounts of Central African foragers doing more up close hunting with use of nets and such. And so that could, and in mixed gender parties. I don't know if that is accurate or not in your field site. So I was just wondering, like, do you expect a strong sex difference, for example, and exposure to certain kinds of risks, such as this specific thing of biting? And if do you expect it? Do you find it? Or if you don't find it, why do you think you don't find it?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Our field site, the ACA, are net hunters, and both sexes and actually kids participate. And it's actually the men that drive the forest antelope into the nets, and then the women spear them. So both sexes are heavily involved, and I guess you could even argue that women are maybe more at risk of being bitten than men in the ACA. In some of the eastern groups, they are bow hunters, and those are, so for the FA, for example, if my memory serves me correctly, they're bow hunters, and it's the males that are hunting, and females are actually working in gardens. But you're right, there are important hunter-gatherer populations where women are thoroughly involved in hunting and might also be at risk. Now, as for the sex difference in drug use, you're also right. We might just say, that there's such a huge sex difference here in drug use in the adults and adolescents. And we don't see as dramatic, but we certainly see evidence for male bias in drug use across cultures, regardless of the drug. So this is a pretty common pattern. In the ACA here, it's the biggest sex difference I think that's been ever documented in any culture in any drug use, close to 100% to zero. And our women are avoiding these psychoactive compounds is the same reason that kids do, where kids almost all completely avoid these as well, even in the ACA. And that is that it would disrupt pregnancy. These things are teratogens. They can induce abortions, miscarriages, problems in brain development. And when, I'll be honest, actually what got me onto this is when we first noticed this huge sex difference was it was over 10 years ago. And we just started talking to the ACA about this. And we were asking women, why don't you use it? And it's bad for the baby. I'm like, of course, I'm an idiot.
Right.
So we think that the sex difference is explained in large part by the fact that women are avoiding these substances to avoid problems in fetal development. So we call it the fetal protection hypothesis. Some of the other evidence we have in favor of that is that higher fertility rates in populations are associated with lower levels of female tobacco use in those populations. Nevertheless, women, for example, this woman drawing Matunga here, the men smoke this plant, the women do not. This plant has been shown in vitro to contain compounds that kill helminths. But what the women will do is make a tea of it and drink it instead of smoking it. Now, the men do not say they're smoking it to get rid of their helminths. That's our interpretation. They just say they're smoking it for the same reason that anybody would say they're smoking cigarettes. But the women are explicitly making a tea of it and drinking that tea to treat worms. So what we think might be going on is that women are self-medicating as well, but they're doing it in a more targeted way when they know they're not pregnant, for example, and there's no risk of fetal harm. So if you make a tea, you can, instead of smoking Matunga every day, you can drink Matunga when Matunga tea. So that's kind of my working hypothesis to deal with some of the sex differences, is that there's more of a targeted use of these compounds by women than we see with men. And there might be, we know that there are, sex differences in immunity, so women may have upregulated immune systems. They may be able to alter their exposure to pathogens in other ways. So I think that it's a complex story that we are far from teasing apart at this point.
Right. Great. Thanks for that information.
Yeah.
I just can't let Ed go without, a little bit of difference of opinion.
Okay, fair enough.
I mean, it wouldn't be in keeping with our long history of the two of us. I think, while I'm as functionalist as the next guy on a lot of this stuff, I think looking at the gender and age patterns, you really have to, resort to non-functionalist explanations as more parsimonious. So simply differences in risk taking, and if there are drugs which which are not psychoactive but have medicinal value, I would expect that you don't see those gender patterns, and you don't see those age patterns, that the gender and the age are explicable. Why adolescence? Well, because there's an increase in risk taking across the board, and psychoactive experiences, are recognized as risky, right? That is, something changes in your perception of reality, even if it's only a mild change. And men are more risk prone than women. I mean, that strikes me as a much more parsimonious explanation than something complicated.
We do have risk data in this population for their tobacco use, and you're right that we see more tobacco and marijuana use. We measured risk with honey collection and tree climbing. So the honey collectors and tree climbers were more likely to smoke tobacco and marijuana than the others. So yeah, I'm a little skeptical on the risk story, because it really is this Western notion that drugs are bad that plays so heavily into the fact that we link risk and drug use. So I have my prior, I have a kind of a low prior on that, even though it is the standard story across a huge amount of social science research. So I don't dismiss it. We actually have evidence for it in the ACA, but I think it's also been overly influenced by our Western story about bad drugs.
Well, but so you can test that by looking at things that are mildly psychoactive, but really don't have much change in people's perceptions. So betel nut, for example, throughout Southeast Asia is, either there's no gender difference, or women use it more than men do. And, it's not experienced, I think, as with the same addictive properties, although it does have, clearly has some addictive properties as tobacco, for example, which is overwhelmingly male throughout that culture region. So, there's a directional prediction there, which is that the more that people experience it as changing your perceptions of reality and as creating deep cravings, the more that the gender and age effects are going to hold.
I don't have it here, but we have coffee. We have biomarker evidence of coffee in the US anyway. And is there do people really view coffee as being risky? I doubt it. And yet I don't have the data here, unfortunately. But if I were to show you the caffeine biomarker data, what we see is that, and we actually see this in nicotine too, it increases equally in adolescents and males and females. And then as we enter the reproductive years, male use of caffeine continues to increase, females levels often actually decreases. So we have a sex difference in caffeine use that I think is kind of hard to link to risk taking.
You could say the same thing about involvement of violence or recreational risk taking across the board. It probably shows very similar demographic patterns. And it's not because, getting killed is bad for your womb. It's just a difference in life history strategy between the sexes.
Yeah, I realize I can't totally rule out risk, but I'm not willing to go there for every drug at this point, but fair point.
All right.
All right. Well, thanks for this nice it added discussion that we've been able to have here, Ed, and there's much more as well for everyone, I'm sure, to follow up and engage with you on these topics. And thank you for also, I just want to say personally for jumping into the mix here and giving this talk on relatively short notice. I really appreciate that personally, and we all here at Beck, of course, are very lucky to have you here contributing to our series. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. Glad to be
yeah.
here.